Previously, on the silent Disruptor. Jonah Vance was 9 years old when a flash crash wiped out most of his mother's retirement savings in 19 minutes. 8 years later, he was 17, a self-taught coder who'd watched the same predatory pattern hollow out his neighborhood and decided to do something no one his age was supposed to be able to do. He turned down a bank internship, recruited a disillusioned systems engineer named Nia Okafor, and, guided by a retired market structure regulator named Arthur Pembroke, built Echo, a trading signal network with no headquarters, no company that owned it, and no single point anyone could shut down. 26,000 computers, run by ordinary people, mirroring the same market view institutions had always kept for themselves. It worked. It grew. And it got noticed. Marcus Sterling, founder of Sterling Capital Partners, read one line in a journalist's article, built by a coalition no single firm controls, and asked his general counsel a question that would define the next 18 months. If no one controls it, who do we sue? And in the final hours before the story you're about to see, retired regulator Arthur Pembroke delivered a warning of his own. This wasn't coming as one lawsuit. It was coming as a season. Here is what a season actually costs a 17-year-old. Not one attack. 5, coordinated. Not one enemy. A senator, a hedge fund CEO, and a founder's own friend, each moving in the same 90-second window without ever sitting in the same room. Over the next 18 months, Echo would be named on the floor of the Senate, starved by its own hosting providers, and betrayed from the inside by someone who traded a founder's seat for a version of safety he thought he needed more. And still, the network Nia built to survive anything would face the one thing no simulation ever modeled. An enemy who knew exactly where to aim. This is the 18 months of legal war. This is how it ends. Senator Dianne Corvith opens a hearing on unregulated retail trading infrastructure, with Echo named directly for the first time in public. Senator Dianne Corvith opened the hearing with a single sentence that made every financial reporter in the room sit up. Today we examine a system explicitly designed to have no one to hold accountable. She named Echo 4 minutes later, and by the closing gavel, that phrase had run in 74 headlines. Jonah watched the hearing from the rented office on a shared laptop. Nobody spoke for 9 minutes after it ended. The moment from scene 1, now shown from the other side, Sterling Capital's legal and infrastructure partners execute a synchronized termination across 12 hosting relationships tied to Echo. This is the order we opened with. 10 months before it happened, Marcus Sterling's general counsel had finally found her answer to, who do we sue? You don't sue a network, you starve it. Sterling Capital had quiet influence over roughly 7% of the infrastructure Echo's nodes ran on. Under the 4% rule, that alone shouldn't have mattered. It mattered because 3 other firms, quietly coordinated, moved in the same 90-second window. The plan wasn't a lawsuit. It was a synchronized amputation, aimed at every limb at once. Under pressure and fear of personal legal exposure, Derek Holloway is approached separately and offered immunity plus a payout to hand over internal architecture documents. Derek Holloway was the third builder, the one who traded freelance stability for equity in something unproven, and he was also the one a private investigator found easiest to frighten. A lawyer he'd never met bought him breakfast and explained, calmly, the difference between a founder and an unindicted facilitator. Derek signed the documents that morning. He didn't tell Jonah or Nia for 5 weeks. When he finally did, he said only, I can't afford a lawyer like theirs. You two barely can either. Jonah didn't yell. He just asked quietly what Derek had given them. That question, what exactly had been handed over, would matter more than any of them yet understood. Jonah and Nia discover exactly what Derek handed over, and realize the coordinated crackdown now has a map. What Derek gave them wasn't code. The code was open source, published for anyone to audit. That had always been the point. What he gave them was worse. The informal map of which hosting providers carried which redundant nodes, the operational knowledge that let 4 firms synchronize a shutdown to the same 90-second window instead of guessing at random. Nia read the deposition summary twice, then said the sentence that would guide the next 4 months. They don't need to break the code. They just needed to know where to aim. This is the morning from scene 1, now shown in full. 12 hosting relationships go dark, and the redundancy architecture Nia built 2 years earlier reroutes the network in real time. This is the morning we started with. Now, the whole picture. At 11:47 a.m., 12 hosting relationships went dark within 90 seconds, representing roughly 7% of Echo's total infrastructure. The 4% rule meant no single provider's failure could cascade. The redundancy Nia designed at 3 a.m. 2 years earlier meant the remaining 93% of the network simply absorbed the load and kept mirroring live order flow data. Somewhere in Chicago, a technician watched a dashboard climb instead of die. Somewhere in Cleveland, Jonah got a phone call at 11:53 a.m. He didn't need to be told what happened. The network told him first, by not going down. 4 firms file a coordinated lawsuit against Echo's builders, alleging unregistered securities market infrastructure and unlicensed data distribution. The lawsuit ran to 194 pages and named Jonah Vance and Nia Okafor personally, alleging unregistered market infrastructure across state lines. Arthur Pembroke flew in from Vermont the day it was filed. He told them the plaintiffs wanted a settlement more than a verdict. A quiet death was cheaper for everyone's headlines than a public trial. Nia asked what the alternative looked like. Arthur said, public. So, expensive. And probably the only way anyone remembers why you built this in the first place. Layla Anwar publishes a follow-up investigation revealing that the 4 plaintiff firms coordinated the infrastructure shutdown before filing suit. Layla Anwar had spent 4 months tracing the map, not the code, thread Nia flagged months earlier, and she published it under a headline that didn't need embellishing. They shut it off first, then sued it for existing. The article laid out the internal timeline, the synchronized 90-second shutdown, then the lawsuit filed 6 weeks later. Within a week, 2 of the 4 plaintiff firms quietly withdrew from the suit. Sterling Capitals did not. Marcus Sterling told his board, in a meeting Layla later confirmed through 2 sources, withdrawing now looks worse than losing. Now 18, Jonah testifies, choosing plain language over technical jargon, explaining the system the way he first explained it to Nia in the library. Jonah Vance had rehearsed technical testimony for 3 weeks. On the stand, he abandoned all of it. When opposing counsel asked him to explain how the network prevented single-point failure, he described a one-way mirror broken into 26,000 pieces, none of them essential. He talked for 5 minutes without a single slide. Arthur Pembroke, watching from the gallery, later said it was the best cross-examination performance I've seen from someone who has never once thought of himself as a performer. The court's ruling is a split decision. Echo isn't ordered to shut down, but its public-facing sign-up and reporting interfaces must register under new market data oversight rules. The verdict, when it came, satisfied no one completely, which Arthur Pembroke said afterward was usually the sign of a fair one. The court did not order Echo dismantled. It also did not declare the network above regulation. It required the builders to register the human-facing edges of the system, the sign-up portal and public reporting dashboards, under existing market data rules, while leaving the decentralized mirroring layer itself untouched. Sterling Capital's spokesperson called it a win. Jonah called it a door we can live with, instead of the one we wanted. Elaine Vance watches the verdict coverage on the small television in her living room, quietly proud, focused only on what it means for people like her. Elaine Vance watched the verdict coverage on the small television in her living room, understood perhaps a third of the legal language, and cared about exactly one sentence. The fair pricing kept flowing. She didn't call her son to talk about registration requirements or mirroring layers. She called to ask if he'd eaten dinner. He said he had. She didn't believe him. She was right not to. A brief, unsentimental coda on Derek Holloway, not villainized, but shown living with the consequence of his choice. Derek Holloway was never charged with anything. That had been the entire deal. He also was never invited back. He watches Echo's growth from a distance now, on the same news feeds as everyone else, a footnote in an origin story he helped write. He told a reporter, once, off the record, "I don't regret being able to afford a lawyer. I regret that those felt like the only 2 options I could see." Jonah, now 19 and leading a team of over 60 contributors, writes a public charter for how Echo will handle future regulatory conflicts. 1 year after the verdict, Jonah Vance published something no lawyer told him to write. A public charter, 9 pages, explaining exactly how Echo would respond to future government inquiries in advance in plain language, before any crisis forced the explanation out of them. Nia edited it 3 times for clarity. Arthur Pembroke read the final draft and said only, "This is the document I wished someone had written 30 years ago, before I was the one enforcing the rules instead of writing them honestly." Jonah sent it to Layla Anwar before it was ever pushed live. She ran it verbatim. In the new Echo governance meeting room, 1 chair is left permanently empty and unlabeled. A quiet acknowledgement of Derek's original contribution. In Echo's meeting room, there are 5 chairs and 4 governance leads. The 5th chair has no nameplate. New contributors ask about it during onboarding. Jonah tells them the same thing every time. Somebody sat there at the beginning. It didn't work out. We don't pretend he wasn't there, and we don't pretend nothing happened. The chair stays because both things are true. Nobody has ever asked a follow-up question. Everyone understands exactly what it means. A message arrives from a small investor in a different state whom Echo helped get a fair fill for the first time, thanking Jonah, and asking how she can help bring the same tool to her own community. 3 years and 26,000 nodes after a kitchen table in East Cleveland, a message arrived at Echo's office from a woman in Arizona, someone Jonah had never personally met. She thanked him for a trade that had, for once, filled at a fair price. Then she asked a second question. How could her town help the next town do the same thing? Jonah read the message twice. He picked up the phone and called his mother. He said, "Someone wants to know how we did it." Elaine said, "Tell them the truth. Tell them it started with someone watching the wrong number drop." The system he built didn't win in the way Wall Street measures winning. It changed what winning meant for people the old market had never planned to show the whole picture to. Fade to gold. Jonah Vance was 17 years old, technically still in high school, and watching a market that had once taken almost everything from his mother. He didn't sue the system. He didn't wait for it to change. He built a version of it that showed everyone the same thing at the same time, then spent 3 years proving it could survive the firms that tried to unplug it. If this story made you think differently about who gets to see the market clearly, you belong here. Subscribe to the Dawn Film Vault. Because we don't just tell stories about people who disrupt the system, we show you exactly what it costs, what they risk, and what's left standing when the dust settles. This is the Dawn Film Vault. We don't just tell the story, we tell the truth of it. See you in the next one.